Thanksgiving in our small town was never just a holiday. It was a spectacle. The Carsons, the unofficial pillars of our community, hosted an annual dinner so grand it bordered on theatrical. Every year, people arrived with dishes they had labored over, hoping to gain approval from Mrs. Carson's critical eye. The piece de resistance, however, was always the turkey, sourced from the local farms, plump and pristine. I'd lived here my entire life, watching the traditions unfold like clockwork. Yet this year there was something off. It began with the strange footprints in the snow, leading from Henry Walker's farm to the edge of the woods. No one could identify the tracks. They were too large to belong to any fox or coyote we'd ever seen, yet too erratic to belong to a person. By the time the third farm reported missing turkeys, the town buzzed with theories ranging from pranksters to escaped circus animals. I admit I was skeptical. A missing turkey wasn't exactly cause for alarm, but the unease was palpable. I had never seen Henry Walker so rattled. The man was stoic by nature, his voice a monotone drawl. But now, he avoided eye contact, muttering about shadows moving too quickly and a low, guttural sound echoing in the woods at night. The Carsons remained undeterred. Tradition is tradition, Mrs. Carson declared to a crowd gathered in the church hall. We'll find our turkey, and we'll celebrate as we always have. 2 days before Thanksgiving, the solution appeared, or rather was delivered. A local hunter, Roy Higgins, stumbled into town dragging a turkey larger than any of us had ever seen. The bird was magnificent, its feathers an iridescent black with streaks of deep green that shimmered in the light. Caught it near the creek, Roy said, puffing out his chest. Thing didn't even run, just stood there like it was waiting for me. There was a collective cheer. The turkey became the talk of the town. Some joked it was so large it might have been eating the missing birds. Mrs. Carson immediately took charge, ushering it to her farm with the help of her son, Daniel. But I couldn't shake the memory of the bird's eyes. They weren't the glassy, vacant eyes of livestock awaiting their fate. They were sharp, almost calculating, and they locked on me for a moment too long before Daniel led it away. That night, the peculiarities began. As I lay in bed, the faint sound of clattering drifted through my open window. At first, I thought it was the wind knocking a loose shutter, but the noise persisted, erratic and purposeful. Against my better judgment, I stepped outside. The air carried an earthy scent, damp and musky. In the moonlight, I saw Mrs. Carson's farmhouse in the distance, its windows glowing faintly. A shadow moved across one of them, too quickly, and at an angle that didn't make sense. A cold unease crept into my stomach. I turned back to my house, my pace quickening, and locked the door behind me. Sleep eluded me. I couldn't escape the feeling that somewhere out there, in the dark, the turkey was watching. The following morning, the town carried on as though nothing unusual had happened. People exchanged recipes, debated stuffing versus dressing, and gossiped about who would arrive at the Carson dinner wearing what. But I couldn't stop thinking about the shadow I'd seen. It was just past midday when I found myself walking toward the Carson farm. I told myself I was being neighborly, checking in to see if they needed help with the dinner preparations. Truthfully, I was curious. The image of the bird's unsettling eyes lingered, a silent accusation against my own imagination. The farm looked picturesque as always, its white fencing pristine against the dull gray of the overcast sky. But as I stepped closer, the silence struck me. Usually, the place hummed with activity, dogs barking, chickens clucking, the faint buzz of conversation. Today, it was unnaturally quiet. I knocked on the door and waited. No response. "Mrs. Carson?" I called, my voice carrying into the stillness. The front door creaked open, and Daniel's face appeared. His usual easy smile was absent, replaced with a strained expression that made him look older than his 25 years. "Sorry," he said quickly. "We're just a little busy. Mom's resting." Resting? Mrs. Carson was notorious for her energy, especially before the big dinner. "Is everything all right?" He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. "Yeah, just getting things ready. You know how it is." Before I could respond, a noise erupted from the back of the house. A metallic clatter, followed by a sound that made my skin prickle. It was low and guttural, almost like a growl, but there was something distinctly unnatural about it. "What was that?" I asked. Daniel's face tightened. "The turkey," he said quickly. "It's in the barn. It's been feisty." "Feisty," I repeated, but he was already closing the door. "We'll see you tomorrow," he said, his tone final. I lingered for a moment before turning toward the barn. The large wooden structure loomed at the edge of the property, its doors slightly ajar. A chill wind pushed one of them open wider as I approached. Inside, the light was dim, the air heavy with the scent of hay and something else. Something metallic and sharp. The turkey's enclosure was near the back, and I could just make out its dark shape through the shadows. It wasn't pacing or fluttering as I'd expected. It was perfectly still, its head tilted as though listening. I took a step closer, the floorboards creaking beneath me. The bird turned its head sharply, and for the second time, I was struck by its eyes. They were unnervingly bright, glinting in the faint light like polished stones. A loud thud behind me made me spin around. A pitchfork had fallen from its hook, landing mere inches from where I stood. My pulse quickened as I scanned the barn, but I saw nothing, no one. When I turned back, the turkey was pressed against the enclosure's wooden slats, its beak open as if it were hissing. But the sound that emerged wasn't a hiss at all. It was a low, rumbling noise, almost like laughter. I stumbled backward, my breath catching. The bird didn't move, but its eyes followed me as I fled the barn. As I hurried home, the distant sound of the turkey's strange, mocking noise seemed to echo behind me. That night, I bolted every door and window in my house. But even the sturdiest locks couldn't keep out the feeling that something was already inside. Thanksgiving morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of weather that seemed to muffle sound and color alike. Despite the muted atmosphere, the town was alive with anticipation. I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me since visiting the Carson farm, but it clung to me like a second skin. I took the long way to the church that morning, walking past the Carsons' property. From the road, the barn looked undisturbed, its doors shut tight against the chill. The house, however, was a different story. One of the upstairs windows was wide open, the lace curtain fluttering lazily. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a figure standing just behind the curtain, but when I blinked, it was gone. The church service was brief, as it always was on Thanksgiving. A few hymns, a short sermon about gratitude, and then we were dismissed with reminders to be at the Carson dinner by 3 o'clock sharp. As people shuffled out, I caught snatches of conversation about the turkey. "Biggest bird we've ever had," someone said. "Roy's still bragging about catching it," another chimed in. I kept my thoughts to myself, but the words feisty and mocking echoed in my mind. By the time I arrived at the Carsons for dinner, the house was a flurry of activity. Guests filled every room, chatting and laughing, their voices rising over the clinking of glasses and the hum of holiday music. The dining table was already set, gleaming with silverware and adorned with a centerpiece of autumn leaves and candles. Daniel greeted me at the door, his smile as forced as it had been the day before. "Glad you could make it," he said, ushering me inside. His eyes darted around the room as though he were scanning for something or someone. "Where's Mrs. Carson?" I asked, noticing her absence. "In the kitchen," he replied quickly. "She's been busy." The kitchen door was slightly ajar, and I could see her bustling about, her movements sharp and almost frantic. Pots clanged, the oven door slammed shut, and a plume of steam billowed out. She didn't acknowledge me, and Daniel didn't offer to bring me closer. I wandered through the house, exchanging pleasantries with neighbors and sipping cider, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. It wasn't just me. Others were noticing it too. Conversations faltered, laughter felt strained, and more than once, I caught people glancing toward the kitchen or out the windows toward the barn. At precisely 3 o'clock, Daniel appeared in the doorway, calling for everyone to gather in the dining room. We took our seats, the chairs scraping loudly against the floor as the room fell into an expectant hush. The doors to the kitchen swung open, and Mrs. Carson emerged, flanked by Daniel and Roy Higgins. Between them, they carried the turkey on a grand platter. The bird was enormous, its skin golden and glistening, garnished with sprigs of rosemary and slices of orange. A collective murmur of approval swept through the room. As the turkey was placed in the center of the table, I felt an inexplicable chill. The bird's eyes were closed, its head turned slightly to one side. But even in stillness, it exuded an unsettling presence. Mrs. Carson took her place at the head of the table, raising a glass to offer the traditional Thanksgiving toast. Her voice wavered slightly as she spoke, and for the first time, I noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the pallor of her skin. "To tradition," she said, her voice tight. "To tradition," the guests echoed, though the response lacked its usual warmth. The carving knife gleamed as Daniel picked it up, the blade catching the light of the flickering candles. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his grip faltering. Then, as the knife descended, a sharp, deafening crack echoed through the room, like wood splintering under tremendous pressure. The lights flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. Gasps erupted around the table, and when the light returned, the turkey was no longer still. Its head had shifted, its closed eyes now open, gleaming with an unnatural brightness. No one moved, no one spoke, and then the bird's chest rose. Once, twice, the first scream shattered the silence, and chaos erupted. The room erupted into chaos. Chairs scraped against the wooden floor as people stumbled back, their faces pale with disbelief. I stood frozen, unable to reconcile what I was seeing. The unmistakable rise and fall of the turkey's chest, slow and deliberate, as though it were drawing in deep breaths. Mrs. Carson let out a strangled cry and stepped back, knocking over her glass. Wine spilled across the pristine tablecloth, its crimson stain creeping toward the centerpiece. Daniel, still holding the carving knife, stared at the bird as though he'd been turned to stone. "It's a trick," someone muttered from the far end of the table, their voice trembling. "It has to be a trick," but no one moved to confirm it. The turkey's head tilted slowly, unervingly lifelike, until its glistening eyes seemed to meet mine. My stomach churned as I realized the gleam in those eyes wasn't just light, it was awareness. Daniel took a step back, the knife clattering to the floor. That sound seemed to snap Mrs. Carson out of her stupor. "Roy," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising murmur of panic. "What did you bring into my house?" Roy Higgins, who until now had been puffed up with pride over his catch, looked ashen. It was just a bird," he stammered. I didn't know." Before he could finish, the turkey twitched. Its legs, bound tightly with twine, shifted against the platter. The ornate rosemary garnish scattered onto the table as the bird's wings gave a sudden, violent shudder. The sound of the movement was wet and visceral, like raw meat tearing. A collective gasp filled the room, and the guests closest to the table scrambled backward, knocking over chairs and nearly trampling one another in their haste. "Get it out of here," someone shouted, but no one dared to approach. Mrs. Carson turned to her husband, her eyes wide with desperation. "Daniel, do something." Daniel didn't move. He stood rigid, his gaze locked on the turkey as though he were afraid it might lunge at him. The candles on the table flickered, their flames growing unnaturally long and thin, casting distorted shadows on the walls. A low hum filled the room, like the sound of wind rushing through a narrow corridor, though the air itself was still. And then the turkey moved. Not a spasm, not the involuntary twitch of a lifeless body, but deliberate motion. Its bound legs jerked violently, snapping the twine with a sickening crack. The bird reared up, its wings spreading wide, the glossy skin splitting in places to reveal raw, sinewy flesh beneath. Pandemonium erupted. People screamed, some darting for the door, others frozen in place, their eyes wide with horror. I backed away, my chair tipping over behind me as I tried to put distance between myself and the thing that had once been a centerpiece. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear anything else, but above the din, I caught snippets of Mrs. Carson's frantic pleas. "It's not possible. It's not possible." The turkey let out a sound, a deep, guttural noise that didn't belong to any bird I'd ever heard. It was almost human, like the strained groan of someone struggling to wake from a nightmare. Roy Higgins, perhaps out of guilt or sheer bravado, lunged toward the table, grabbing the carving knife from the floor. He raised it high, his jaw set, his movements desperate. "Stay back," he shouted, though whether the warning was for us or the turkey, I couldn't tell. The bird turned its head toward him slowly, deliberately. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a speed that defied logic, it leapt from the platter, its wings flapping wildly. The force of its movement knocked Roy backward, sending him sprawling into the table. Plates shattered, glasses toppled, and the centerpiece went up in flames as one of the candles tipped over, igniting the dried leaves. "Fire!" Someone screamed, but no one moved to put it out. All eyes were on the turkey, which now stood on the table, its warped body silhouetted against the growing blaze. I could feel the heat on my face, could smell the acrid tang of burning fabric, but my feet refused to carry me toward the door. Something about the scene before me held me captive, as though leaving would mean missing the answer to an unspoken question. The turkey's eyes scanned the room, taking in the chaos it had created. For one chilling moment, they landed on me, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, the bird turned and leapt toward the open kitchen door, disappearing into the shadows beyond. Silence fell over the dining room, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the labored breathing of those who remained. I didn't move, couldn't, because somewhere in the depths of the house, I could still hear it. the sound of wings dragging across the floorboards, growing fainter but never fully gone. The room was a graveyard of overturned chairs and shattered porcelain, the acrid stench of smoke hanging heavy in the air. The flames from the centerpiece had been extinguished, but their memory lingered in the smoldering edges of the tablecloth. The guests, wide-eyed and breathless, clung to one another in a stunned silence that felt heavier than any scream could have been. I couldn't shake the image of the turkey's warped form as it vanished into the house. It wasn't just its unnatural movement or the grotesque noise it had made. It was the way it had looked at me, as though it saw more than my face. "We need to leave," a woman murmured, clutching her husband's arm with trembling hands. But Mrs. Carson, standing rigid at the head of the table, seemed oblivious to the panic around her. "No one's leaving," she said, her voice low but steady. "Not until we figure out what just happened." "Figure it out?" Roy Higgins spat, nursing a shallow gash on his forearm from his failed attempt to confront the thing. "That wasn't natural, Rebecca. That wasn't right. It was some kind of disease," Daniel said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "Something infected the bird. Made it react that way." "React?" I found myself asking, though I hadn't intended to speak. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, thin and brittle. "Is that what we're calling it?" No one answered. From somewhere deep in the house, a sharp clatter broke the silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. All heads turned toward the darkened doorway leading to the kitchen. "Did you hear that?" Someone whispered, as though saying it aloud might bring the sound closer. Daniel straightened, his face pale but resolute. "Stay here. I'll check it out." "No," Mrs. Carson said sharply, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the fear beneath. "We stay together." The group hesitated, a silent debate playing out in the exchange of glances. But no one seemed eager to defy her. Slowly, we began to move as one, a cluster of hesitant footsteps heading toward the kitchen. The flickering light from the dining room cast long, distorted shadows on the walls, making every corner seem alive. When we reached the kitchen, it was empty, or at least it appeared to be. The room was a mess. Shattered plates littered the floor, and one of the windows had been smashed inward, the icy wind carrying with it a faint dusting of snow. "It must have gone outside," Daniel said, though his tone was more hopeful than certain. "I don't think so," I murmured, my gaze fixed on the trail of oily, dark streaks smeared across the floor. They led not to the broken window, but to the pantry door, which hung slightly ajar. "Don't," someone whispered behind me as I stepped forward. The pantry door creaked on its hinges as I pushed it open. The small space beyond was dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through a high, narrow window, but it was enough to see that it was empty, or so I thought. As I turned to leave, a low, rhythmic thumping sound drew my attention to the far corner. My heart pounded as I stepped closer, squinting into the shadows. There, nestled among the sacks of flour and canned goods, was an object that shouldn't have been there. The carving knife Roy had dropped earlier, its blade now embedded in the wooden floor. The air around me felt heavy, oppressive, as though the walls were leaning in. I reached for the knife, my hand trembling. The instant my fingers closed around the handle, the thumping stopped. A chill ran down my spine as I straightened, gripping the knife tightly. For a moment, the silence was absolute. And then, from the darkness beyond the pantry, I heard it. A sound that was neither human nor animal, a guttural, clicking noise that seemed to echo inside my skull. I backed out of the pantry, nearly colliding with Daniel. "It's still here," I whispered. The group retreated to the dining room, where the remnants of the feast lay untouched. The tension in the air was suffocating, each of us too afraid to speak, to move, as though the slightest sound might summon the thing back to us. Then the lights flickered, once, twice, and went out. The room plunged into darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the moon filtering through the windows. Someone cursed under their breath, and I could hear the shuffle of feet as people instinctively pressed closer together. "Stay calm," Mrs. Carson said, though her voice wavered. But calm was impossible, because in the silence, I heard it again, the sound of wings dragging across the floorboards, closer now. And then, a voice, low, guttural, and chillingly deliberate. More. The voice reverberated through the darkness, too close for comfort, too alien to comprehend. I froze, gripping the knife as if it were the only tether holding me to sanity. Around me, I felt the others stiffen, their collective terror so palpable it seemed to thicken the very air we breathed. "Who said that?" Daniel's voice cut through the silence, low and shaking. "Don't antagonize it," Mrs. Carson hissed. But it didn't matter. The thing in the shadows was already moving. A sound, like dry branches scraping against stone, began circling us. Slow, deliberate, predatory. I tried to follow it with my eyes, but the darkness was oppressive, swallowing everything beyond the faint silver glow from the window. "It's in here," someone whispered, the words trembling on their lips. The scraping noise grew louder, shifting closer, and then something else emerged. A faint, wet dragging sound, as though the thing were pulling itself along the floor. "Light," Mrs. Carson commanded, her voice brittle but firm. "Someone find a flashlight." I felt the group stir into reluctant motion, hands fumbling through drawers and pockets. Someone lit a match, the feeble glow briefly illuminating the faces around me. They were pale and wide-eyed, masks of horror carved into living flesh. The match sputtered and died, plunging us back into darkness. And then came the thud, a single heavy impact against the dining room table, followed by the faintest creak of wood straining under a great weight. My breath caught in my throat as I imagined it, perched there in the dark, watching us. "We need to leave," I said, the words a harsh whisper. "No one's leaving," Mrs. Carson snapped. "Whatever it is, it's not getting out of this house." A flashlight flicked on then, its beam slicing through the shadows. Daniel held it high, the light shaking as his hands trembled. The beam swept across the room, finding nothing but overturned chairs and the remnants of our ruined dinner. But then it caught something. The turkey. It lay on the table, motionless, its golden skin now split and sagging, revealing the blackened mass beneath. The room fell deathly silent as the beam lingered on it, as though the light itself had disturbed some fragile equilibrium. And then the turkey moved. It was subtle at first, a faint shudder, like the ripple of a dying animal's last breath. But then it jerked violently, the entire carcass convulsing as though something inside it was trying to claw its way out. The flashlight beam wavered as Daniel stumbled back, his breathing ragged. "Turn it off," Mrs. Carson said suddenly, her voice sharp with desperation. "Turn off the light." "What?" Daniel stammered. "Do it," she shouted, and for a moment, I thought she might lunge for him. The beam vanished, plunging us back into blackness. "Why?" I demanded, my voice rising despite myself. "Because it feeds on it," she said, her words barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "The light wakes it." A loud crash interrupted her, something heavy striking the floor. Someone screamed, the sound raw and primal. I could hear chairs scraping against the floor as people scrambled away from the noise. "It's moving!" Roy's voice cut through the chaos, high-pitched with fear. I backed against the wall, my knife held out in front of me like a feeble shield. My other hand found the edge of the dining room table, the wood smooth and familiar beneath my fingertips. The dragging sound was back, louder now, circling us with a terrible deliberation. And then came a voice, low, guttural, and impossibly close. "More." The word sent a shiver down my spine, not just because of its unnatural tone, but because of the hunger it carried. Whatever this thing was, it didn't just want to terrify us, it wanted to consume us. "What does it want?" Someone whimpered. "Us," Mrs. Carson said flatly. The room erupted into chaos. People began shouting, tripping over one another in their desperate attempts to escape. I heard the sound of breaking glass and realized someone had tried to smash a window. "It's locked us in," Roy cried. "We're trapped." And then the thing struck. A deafening crash filled the room as something massive collided with the table. I felt the force of it reverberate through the floorboards, nearly knocking me off my feet. The flashlight flicked back on, illuminating a brief, terrible sight. The turkey carcass now writhing and swollen, its distorted form tearing at the seams. Inside it, something moved. The light cut out again, and the screaming began. The screaming was deafening. It echoed off the walls, merging with the crash of overturned furniture and the frantic scuffling of feet. I clung to the table, my breath coming in short gasps as I tried to orient myself in the chaos. "Hold still," Mrs. Carson barked, her voice cutting through the din like a whip. "Everyone, stay together." But no one listened. In the choking darkness, survival instincts took over, and people began scattering in all directions, slamming into walls and one another in their desperate attempts to escape. The thing in the room moved again. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Its weight shifting the floorboards beneath us, its presence pressing down on the air like a storm about to break. "Back to the kitchen," Mrs. Carson shouted. "Now!" I forced my legs to move, half crawling, half stumbling toward the faint outline of the doorway. My hand found the edge of the counter, cold and solid beneath my palm, and I pulled myself upright. "Shut the door!" someone yelled, their voice cracking with panic. But before anyone could move, the sound came again. That awful, dragging noise, punctuated by the creak of wood splintering under immense pressure. It was closer now, so close that I could feel the vibration of it in my chest. A hand grabbed my arm, and I nearly screamed before realizing it was Daniel. His face was pale and streaked with sweat, his eyes wild with terror. "We can't stay here," he hissed. "It's toying with us. Where can we go?" I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. "We're trapped." His grip tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. But then the thing let out a sound. A low, guttural rumble that wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a breath, but something in between. It was coming for us. I heard Roy sobbing somewhere nearby, his cries muffled by the sound of shuffling footsteps and the occasional crash of something being knocked over. "Where's the light switch?" Daniel muttered, his hands fumbling along the wall. "Don't!" Mrs. Carson's voice was sharp and immediate. "I told you it feeds on..." She didn't get to finish. A loud crash shook the room, and I felt the floor dip beneath my feet as though the house itself were groaning under the strain. Then came a wet, tearing sound, followed by a scream so raw and visceral that it cut through the noise like a blade. "Roy!" someone yelled, but Roy was already gone. I didn't need to see it to know. His scream had been final, the kind of sound that left no room for hope. "We're next," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. I felt a wave of cold fear wash over me. He was right. Whatever this thing was, it was picking us off one by one, savoring the terror it caused. "To the cellar," Mrs. Carson shouted suddenly. "Everyone, to the cellar." I hesitated. The cellar? It seemed like the worst possible place to go, a confined, inescapable trap. But the alternative was staying here, waiting to be dragged into the darkness like Roy. "Move!" Daniel shoved me toward the narrow doorway that led to the basement stairs. I stumbled forward, nearly tripping over my own feet as I descended into the pitch-black space below. The others followed, their footsteps pounding behind me. The cellar was colder than I expected, the air damp and heavy with the scent of earth. I fumbled for the light switch, but when I found it and flicked it on, nothing happened. "Power's out," Daniel muttered. "Barricade the door," Mrs. Carson ordered. We pushed an old cabinet in front of the door, the wood groaning under the strain. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. For a moment, there was silence. I could hear the others breathing, their gasps loud and uneven in the confined space. My own heartbeat thundered in my ears as I strained to listen for any sign of movement above us. And then it came, a single deliberate creak, followed by the faintest sound of something being dragged across the floor. It was still up there, waiting. "What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to keep it steady. No one answered. Mrs. Carson was staring at the ceiling, her face a mask of grim determination. "It's older than you can imagine," she said finally, her voice low. "And it doesn't forget." "What does that mean?" Daniel demanded. She didn't reply. Above us, the sound came again. A slow, rhythmic scrape that seemed to echo through the walls. And then, faintly, I heard it. A voice. Not a human voice, but something deeper, more resonant, like the earth itself was speaking. It was saying one word, over and over, in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. Hunger. The voice was unrelenting, its single, guttural word filling the darkness of the cellar. Hunger. It resonated in my bones, more felt than heard. A vibration that threatened to unravel the fragile threads of sanity we were clinging to. "Is it outside?" Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. "No," Mrs. Carson said with an unnerving calmness. She was crouched by the cellar door, her ear pressed against the wood. "It's beneath us now." The words struck like a thunderclap. Beneath us. My eyes darted to the floor, tracing the uneven patches of dirt that served as the cellar's foundation. The damp earth smelled richer now, fresher, as if something had stirred it recently. "How can it be below us?" I asked, though my voice betrayed me with its quiver. Mrs. Carson stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. "This land has secrets," she said cryptically, her gaze sweeping the room. "You do well to respect them." "Secrets?" Daniel scoffed, his panic slipping into anger. "What kind of secrets involve this thing? You knew about it, didn't you? That's why you didn't want the lights on. That's why—" "Quiet!" she snapped, her tone carrying enough weight to shut him up instantly. The scraping sound from above resumed, followed by a low, rumbling vibration that seemed to seep into the very ground beneath us. The floor trembled faintly, and I felt the sensation of something enormous shifting in the dirt below. "It's moving," I said, barely able to form the words. Mrs. Carson stepped closer to the center of the room, her eyes narrowing as she studied the floor. "It's always moving," she muttered, almost to herself. "What is it?" I asked, unable to stop the question. She didn't answer. Instead, she knelt and pressed her hand against the dirt. Her fingers dug slightly into the loose earth as if she were feeling for something just out of reach. When she drew back her hand, her palm was trembling, the dirt sticking to it like it had a mind of its own. "It's feeding," she said finally, her voice hollow. "On what?" Daniel demanded. "On us," she said simply. The words settled like a lead weight in the pit of my stomach. A loud, sharp crack interrupted the moment, and I jumped as the far corner of the cellar collapsed inward. Dirt poured through the gap in the foundation, filling the space like water rushing into a sinking ship. "Back!" Mrs. Carson shouted, her commanding voice cutting through the panic. We scrambled away as the floor began to buckle, the dirt rippling unnaturally as though something massive was writhing just beneath the surface. "What do we do?" I shouted, my voice rising in desperation. "Stay together," she said, her tone steel. "And don't touch the dirt." The absurdity of her command barely registered before the cellar erupted into chaos. Another corner of the room gave way, the earth spilling in with a strange, wet sloshing sound. I backed into the far wall, my heart pounding as I watched the center of the cellar begin to sink, the dirt swirling as though being drawn into some unseen maw. "What is this?" Daniel cried, clutching at the wall for support. Mrs. Carson didn't answer. She was staring at the dirt, her expression unreadable, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The vibration intensified, and the voice returned, louder now, a rhythmic chant that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "Hunger, hunger, hunger." Something emerged from the swirling dirt, a long, gnarled shape that was neither root nor bone, but something grotesquely in between. It reached upward, twisting unnaturally, the surface glistening like it was slick with some dark residue. "Run!" I shouted, though I didn't know where we could go. The tendril, or whatever it was, snapped toward us, and I dove to the side just as it struck the wall behind me, leaving a deep, splintered gash in the wood. "To the stairs!" Mrs. Carson barked. We moved as one, scrambling toward the narrow staircase that led back to the house above. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, more metallic. Behind us, the cellar continued to collapse, the ground giving way in great, heaving chunks. I reached the stairs first, my hands gripping the railing as I hauled myself upward. Daniel was right behind me, his breathing ragged and uneven. As I climbed, I glanced back one last time. The thing was fully visible now, its enormous form writhing in the center of the cellar. It was impossible to describe, its shape constantly shifting, its surface pulsating like a living wound. And then I saw them, the eyes. They weren't human, but they weren't entirely alien either. They stared up at me with an intelligence that was cold and ancient, as though it had been watching us long before we arrived. I turned away and climbed faster, the sound of the cellar collapsing behind me like the earth was swallowing itself whole. When we burst into the kitchen, slamming the door shut behind us, the silence was deafening. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then Mrs. Carson turned to me, her face pale but resolute. "It's not over," she said. The kitchen was suffocating. The warm glow of the overhead light felt out of place, its cheerfulness mocking the terror that had unfolded below. Daniel was pacing, muttering incoherently under his breath, while Mrs. Carson stood by the cellar door, Her hand pressed firmly against the wood as if she were trying to feel the heartbeat of the monster below. "It's not over," she'd said, and the words clung to the air like smoke. "What is it?" I asked again, my voice louder this time. The trembling in my hands had spread to my legs, but I forced myself to stand tall to demand answers. Mrs. Carson turned to me slowly, her expression unreadable. "It's what the land keeps hidden. What the traditions have always been for." Daniel stopped pacing. "Traditions? Are you saying this thing has been here all along? And you knew?" Her silence was damning. "You knew," he repeated, his voice rising. He advanced toward her, his fists clenched at his sides. "You knew and you let us." "Enough," she snapped, her voice cutting through his fury like a knife. "I've kept this town safe for decades. This is the first time it's gotten this far." Her words didn't comfort me. If anything, they added to the growing sense of dread. "What does it want?" I asked, stepping between them before the tension could boil over. Mrs. Carson hesitated. "It's complicated, complicated," Daniel barked, throwing his arms in the air. "We just barely escaped with our lives, and you're telling us it's complicated?" The sound of the cellar door creaking cut through our argument. We all froze. Slowly, the door began to bow outward, its old hinges groaning under the strain. The vibrations were back, subtle at first but quickly growing stronger, like a drumbeat beneath our feet. "Move away from the door," Mrs. Carson commanded, her voice low and steady. We obeyed without question, retreating toward the far side of the kitchen. The door bulged outward again, this time accompanied by a faint scratching sound. It wasn't frantic or hurried but deliberate, like something testing its confines. "It's hungry," she whispered. The word sent a shiver down my spine. "Can it get out?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Mrs. Carson didn't respond. Instead, she reached for a heavy wooden chair and jammed it under the doorknob, reinforcing the lock. Felt futile, but none of us dared to say so. Then the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was worse. "Is it gone?" Daniel whispered, though his voice carried no real hope. Mrs. Carson tilted her head, listening intently. "No, just waiting." "For what?" She didn't answer, but her gaze drifted to the kitchen table, where the remnants of our hastily abandoned meal still sat. The turkey, now cold and unappetizing, seemed to draw her attention like a magnet. Her lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. And then the lights flickered. The kitchen plunged into darkness for a brief, heart-stopping moment before the bulbs buzzed back to life, casting their yellowish glow over the room. But something had changed. The turkey on the table wasn't where it had been. "Did anyone touch it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel shook his head, his wide eyes locked on the bird. Mrs. Carson took a cautious step forward. The chair beneath the cellar door creaked ominously, but the door held. She reached the table and leaned in, her face inches from the turkey. "It's not right," she murmured. I didn't need her to explain. The bird's once golden skin now looked unnaturally slick, almost gelatinous, and its size seemed wrong, bigger, bulkier, as if it had grown since we last looked. Then it moved, just a twitch, subtle and quick, but enough to send us all stumbling back. "It's not possible," Daniel said, his voice cracking. "Get back," Mrs. Carson ordered, her hand outstretched to keep us away from the table. The turkey twitched again, this time more violently. Its wings, or what had once been wings, jerked upward, flopping against the table with a sickening squelch. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. "It's part of it," Mrs. Carson said, her voice shaking for the first time. "It's trying to come through." "Come through what?" Daniel shouted. The turkey convulsed, its body splitting down the middle with a wet, tearing sound. From the gash, something began to emerge. A slick, glistening form that defied explanation. It writhed and squirmed, its shape constantly shifting, its surface reflecting the dim light like oil on water. "We have to stop it," Mrs. Carson said, her voice now filled with urgency. "How?" I asked, my mind racing. She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed the carving knife from the counter and approached the table, her movements deliberate but hesitant. The thing inside the turkey seemed to sense her intent. It let out a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the kitchen, making the walls tremble. "Stay back," she warned, though it was unclear whether she was speaking to us or the creature. With a quick, decisive motion, she plunged the knife into the writhing mass. The room erupted into chaos. The thing let out a shriek that wasn't a sound so much as a feeling, a vibration that rattled my teeth and made my vision blur. The walls shook violently, and the cellar door splintered as the force from below surged upward. Mrs. Carson screamed as the knife was wrenched from her hand, the blade flying across the room and embedding itself in the wall. "Run!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the cacophony. We didn't need to be told twice. The hallway felt longer than it had before, stretching into a nightmare of flickering shadows and warped walls. Daniel was ahead of me, his footsteps pounding like gunshots against the hardwood floor. Behind us, Mrs. Carson's voice was barely audible over the relentless, guttural sound coming from the kitchen. A noise that was growing, spreading, filling every inch of the house. "Don't stop," she shouted. But the desperation in her tone was enough to tell me that stopping was no longer a choice. The walls seemed to breathe, the wallpaper peeling in long, curling strips as if the house itself was rotting. I glanced over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. The kitchen doorway was shrouded in darkness, but something moved within it, slow, deliberate, and far too large to belong in a house this size. "Daniel!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Faster! I'm trying!" He snapped, but his pace faltered as he stumbled over a loose floorboard. I reached out instinctively, grabbing his arm and pulling him upright. The noise behind us surged, a wet, slithering sound that made my stomach churn. "Upstairs!" Mrs. Carson's voice came from somewhere behind me, closer than I expected. "Go to the attic." The attic? The very thought sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through me. If we went up there, there'd be no way out, no escape. But there was no time to argue, no time to think. We reached the staircase, and Daniel practically threw himself onto the first step, clawing his way upward like a drowning man grasping for air. I followed close behind, my legs burning with effort as the heavy vibrations from below seemed to climb with us. Mrs. Carson was the last to ascend, her breath ragged but determined. "Keep moving," she barked, her voice cutting through my fear. The stairs groaned beneath our weight, each creak sounding like a scream in the suffocating silence. Behind us, the slithering sound grew louder, accompanied by a deep, resonant hum that I could feel in my bones. We reached the landing, and Mrs. Carson pushed past us, leading the way to the attic door. She fumbled with the latch, her hands shaking as she pulled it open and gestured for us to climb. "In, now!" Daniel scrambled up first, his movements jerky and frantic. I followed, hesitating only long enough to glance back down the hallway. I shouldn't have looked. The thing from the kitchen was at the base of the stairs now, its form partially obscured by the shifting shadows. It wasn't solid, not entirely, but its shape was wrong in every conceivable way. Limbs that weren't limbs stretched and folded in impossible directions, and its surface seemed to ripple like water disturbed by an unseen wind. Paused, as if sensing my gaze, and then it surged forward. "Go!" Mrs. Carson screamed, shoving me upward with more force than I thought she was capable of. I clambered into the attic, barely managing to avoid tripping over Daniel, who was crouched in the corner with his arms wrapped around his knees. Mrs. Carson followed, slamming the door shut behind her and bracing it with her body. "Help me," she ordered, her voice sharp and commanding. Daniel and I scrambled to comply, dragging a heavy trunk across the floor and wedging it against the door. It didn't feel like enough. "What is that thing?" I demanded, my voice trembling. Mrs. Carson didn't answer immediately. She was staring at the door, her lips pressed into a thin line, her chest heaving. Finally, she spoke. "It's not just one thing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's everything. Everything that's been buried. Everything this town tried to forget. And it's hungry." Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. From the other side of the door, the noise grew louder. A cacophony of wet, slapping sounds and low, guttural growls that made my skin crawl. The door shuddered violently, and the trunk slid an inch across the floor. "It's going to get in," Daniel said, his voice high and panicked. "It's going to—" "Shut up," Mrs. Carson snapped. "It feeds on fear. Don't give it more than it already has." But how could we not? The air was thick with it, the kind of fear that seeped into your lungs and settled in your bones. The attic creaked ominously, the old wood groaning under the weight of something unseen. I glanced around, searching for anything that could help. The attic was cluttered with the detritus of decades past. Dusty boxes, broken furniture, forgotten memories. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, partially obscured by a pile of old newspapers, was a small, circular window. "We can get out through there," I said, pointing. Mrs. Carson followed my gaze, her eyes narrowing. "It's too small. We'll never fit." "We don't have a choice," Daniel shouted, his voice cracking. The door shuddered again, splinters flying as something massive struck it from the other side. Mrs. Carson hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Go. I'll hold it off." "No," I said, shaking my head. "You can't. Go," she yelled, her voice brooking no argument. Daniel didn't need to be told twice. He bolted for the window, pushing aside the newspapers and fumbling with the latch. I hesitated, my gaze locked on Mrs. Carson. She met my eyes, her expression steely. "Don't waste this," she said. And then the door exploded inward. The door splintered like dry wood under the weight of something far too large to be contained. I was still standing there, frozen, when the darkness poured into the attic, thick and suffocating. It wasn't like anything I had seen before. There were no clear edges, no form that could be defined. It swirled in the air, a mass of darkness that breathed and shifted, as though the very essence of it was alive. It was all teeth and hunger, twisting into the space between us. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. I just stared at it, my body locked in place, feeling every instinct scream for me to flee. Mrs. Carson was the first to react. She lunged forward, screaming something I couldn't quite understand, but her words were drowned out by the roar of the thing in the doorway. It didn't matter. Nothing did anymore. Daniel was already at the window, struggling to pull it open, his hands trembling so violently he could barely get a grip on the latch. The air had grown so heavy, it felt like I was drowning. And yet, there was something about it that was almost familiar, like the feeling of déjà vu, but sharper, more suffocating. As I watched Daniel fumble with the window, I realized what it was. The sensation of being hunted. I took a step toward him, but I wasn't sure if it was to help or to escape. The ground beneath my feet felt soft, as if it were no longer solid. What if we never make it out? The thought hit me like a shock to the chest, a wave of cold fear that froze me where I stood. The thing in the doorway was shifting, its form rippling like smoke. It was everywhere at once, stretching, reaching, closing in on us. I could almost hear it laughing, though I was sure it didn't have a voice. There was no need for one. It wasn't here to talk. "Come on." Daniel's voice cracked through my haze of panic, sharp and desperate. He had the window open now, but the hole was too small, and the space between us and freedom was closing rapidly. I forced my legs to move, dragging myself toward him. The attic creaked under the weight of something that wasn't quite natural, something ancient, and it was pressing down on us. The air felt like it was bending, warping, and I could hear the walls groan in protest. Mrs. Carson, for all her earlier insistence, had stopped fighting. She was standing by the door now, facing the swirling mass of darkness with a kind of acceptance. Her hands were raised, palms open, as if she was preparing to offer herself to it. "Go!" She shouted at us, her voice trembling. "Don't look back. Just go." I didn't have the strength to argue, and I didn't know how long we had before it was too late. I lunged for the window, pushing myself up onto the sill just as I heard a screech, a sound that ripped through the attic like a blade against bone. Daniel was already out. I didn't know how, but he was gone, disappearing into the night below, leaving me alone with the suffocating darkness and Mrs. Carson. The window was too narrow, too small, and it was already too late. I tried to push myself out, but the air around me felt thick, as though something was holding me back, pulling me toward the center of the room, toward the terrible presence that was just behind me. A cold breath grazed my neck. I didn't look back. The thing in the doorway, if it could even be called that anymore, was closer. I could feel it, a weight pressing on my chest, choking the breath from my lungs. My body was moving against my will, a puppet on strings pulled taut, forcing me to turn and face it. And there she was, Mrs. Carson. Her face was obscured by shadows, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a look of resignation, as if she knew. She knew what this was, what had always been, beneath the surface of the town's traditions and celebrations. "It's not just a tradition," she whispered, but it wasn't to me. She wasn't speaking to me. She was speaking to the darkness. It never was. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The sound caught in my throat, a knot of terror, unable to escape. The darkness surged toward her, folding over itself as it swallowed her whole. She didn't scream. There was no fight in her. She just let it take her. I managed to force myself out of the window, my legs flailing as I tumbled onto the cold, frozen ground. But I didn't stop, couldn't stop. I had to run. I didn't look back. I ran through the snow, through the woods, through the biting wind. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs ached, and still I couldn't stop. The fear was alive in me, crawling beneath my skin, whispering in my ear, "Run, run," and never stop running. But I did stop. Eventually, when I could no longer hear the night's terrors in the distance, when the forest had swallowed me whole, I stopped to catch my breath, hands clutching at my chest, my body trembling as the weight of what I had just witnessed settled around me. And that's when I saw it. A shadow in the trees, a figure standing still and watching, its eyes gleaming faintly in the moonlight. For a moment, I thought it was Mrs. Carson, but then I realized she wasn't the only one who had understood. I was never supposed to make it out. I was just another part of the feast. The world felt like it was crumbling around me. The cold night air bit at my skin, but it wasn't the cold that made my teeth rattle. It was the weight of what I had just witnessed, the suffocating truth that had settled in my chest. Mrs. Carson had let herself be consumed, and I knew now that there was no escaping whatever was at the heart of this town, whatever it was that had waited for so long. I had been part of it all along, just another thread in a web I had only just begun to comprehend. I couldn't stop running. Every step I took felt like it might be my last, like the ground itself was shifting beneath me, pulling me into the very earth where all these forgotten souls had disappeared. And yet, as the woods closed in on me, I felt something else, something far darker than any mere physical terror. Presence, watching, waiting. I stopped at the edge of the forest, breathless, heart pounding. My chest was tight, and my mind was racing with thoughts of Daniel, of Mrs. Carson, of the terrible truth that had been hidden from us all. I looked around, scanning the trees, expecting something, anything, to emerge from the dark. Then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. Not Mrs. Carson, but someone else. Someone I didn't recognize, yet something about the way it stood there, so still, so deliberate, sent a chill down my spine. I turned to flee, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, a prisoner of my own terror, unable to break free. The figure stepped forward, moving with a kind of grace, like it had been watching me for far longer than I could have imagined. Slowly, it emerged from the shadows, and I felt the air grow colder still. It was Daniel, but not the Daniel I had known. His face was pale, almost gray, his eyes hollow, his mouth stretched in a grotesque smile. "I tried to warn you," he said softly, his voice a whisper on the wind. My heart stopped. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't him. Couldn't be. What are you?" I managed to croak, but the words felt alien on my tongue. Daniel's smile widened, and it was then that I saw it. Something dark and unnatural clinging to the edges of his form, like smoke or shadow, bending and twisting in ways that no human body could. The figure that had been him was no longer entirely human. "You should have listened," he said again, the words dripping with something cold, ancient. "We all have to pay the price. Every one of us." My mind reeled. What price? What had we done? And then I understood. It wasn't the town that had cursed us. It wasn't the darkness that had consumed Mrs. Carson. It wasn't even the horrors I had seen in the attic. We had always been part of it. Daniel wasn't the victim. He was the one who had helped pull me into this, into whatever ritual they had been carrying out for generations. He wasn't escaping. He was returning. He stepped closer, and his form shifted again, his eyes flickering with something darker, deeper, something that wasn't Daniel at all. "Don't worry," he said, his voice now distant, as though someone else was speaking through him. "I wasn't meant to save you. I was meant to keep you here, just like the others." I stumbled backward, but there was no escape. The forest had closed in around me, and all the shadows were alive, creeping toward me, waiting. the figure raised its hand, and in that moment, everything clicked. The strange sensation, the whispers that had followed me since the first night, all of it had been building to this moment, and I was finally seeing the truth. We were never meant to leave. Before I could scream, before I could run, I felt the cold hands of the forest around me, pulling me into the earth. And then, everything went black. The sound of rustling leaves filled the air. A single figure stood at the edge of the woods, staring at the ground. Slowly, they turned, their footsteps deliberate as they walked back toward the town. The feast would begin again soon. It always did.